Good evening. You're listening live to the Two Extreme Horror Show. We are coming to you live from the Pine Hills Palace that's just west of Orlando, Florida, here in good old rainy 86-degree weather, Central Florida. Today I'm your host, Rob, and on this wet and rainy evening I have a host from a great faraway distance, Dalton, the original authenticator. Good evening, sir. How are you?
I am doing well. How's everybody doing tonight?
They are doing splendidly, sir. So tonight, to talk about how splendidly they are with this Two Extreme Horror Show, we're going to be talking about Gretel and Hansel, this movie that came out recently, take on the old Grimm's fairy tale. And so I'll go with my first thoughts and then ask you yours. But for me, I thought the movie wasn't too bad, actually. I kind of liked it. I thought it was very tight. There was no extraneous nonsense with the script. It's visually it's quite stunning to look at, and there was also some very nice scenes in it. I thought the kids, for the most part, did a pretty good job. I know the ages were a little different, probably than the original story or how some people thought of them. And The Witch herself, I thought was pretty good too. So all in all, I'd say thumbs up. It's not a bad movie for all intents and purposes. Don't know that I'd call it a horror film, but that's what we're going to classify it in terms of what we're doing for tonight. So let me ask you, Dalton, your
Well,
original thoughts with this. Oh, I'm sorry, not Hansel and Gretel, but Gretel and Hansel.
you're breaking up a little bit. I don't know if that's just on my end or
Well, I not that's the first I heard you. So what are your thoughts on it, Gretel and Hansel?
okay. So, like most people, I assumed that the reason why the title was switched in this version as opposed to most versions is because they were going to go super feministy. But fortunately, um I was pleasantly surprised to find that that had nothing whatsoever to do with why the title was switched. The
Right.
reason in this movie why the title was switched is because in this movie, rather than just uh, taking care of Hansel and Gretel, the witch is actually looking for an apprentice, and she picks Gretel, which is why she's kind of the main character of the movie. Which, to say nothing else of the movie, is a very interesting twist. But yeah, I mostly agree with your assessment. It's very well stylized. It's made on a very tight budget, but you couldn't tell from the aesthetics of the movie, which is always nice. And the way I would describe this movie is, if you didn't like the movie The Witch from a couple years ago, this movie is kind of like the less pretentious and more sort of action heavy version of The Witch.
Yeah, and I think it's true because this movie, for the most part, other than one or two couple minutes of screen time with one or two very minor characters, 95% of this film is basically the three characters: Gretel, Hansel, and the witch. And I like that. Like I say, it's tight. There's not really an overdose of exposition. It's you get to see what's happening, you get to feel it, and you watch it, and you see it unfold. And it's very deliberately paced. It's not slow setup, a big exposition and then a huge action finale in the third act. It's pretty consistent all the way out too. So, as far as the story goes, were you pleased with the fact that they got reimaged it this way, or what did you think about the girl being older and the kid being younger?
I I liked it. The only thing was everyone else in the movie is affecting some kind of accent in the movie, and Gretel is very much not. And it did a couple of times make me have to do a double take, like, why is everybody else speaking in a vaguely accented voice appropriate for this time period, and you're just speaking in basically modern Valley Girl teen language?
Oh my God, you're gonna like eat my little brother. That's like horrible, totally. Yeah, that would sort
I
of
know.
break what they're
So
trying to do.
yeah,
Yeah,
like
I think
I
for
feel
go ahead.
bad for the kid who played Hansel, because despite the fact that he basically had nothing to do, he was basically a MacGuffin for the entire movie. He was at least trying to affect an accent, and she just didn't bother, and it was kind of annoying.
Yeah, so the story is basically, you get a voiceover at the beginning, and I don't know if you really need it or not, but obviously the story goes that this girl and this boy basically, for this movie's purposes, get thrown out of their house by the mom, who basically says you're functionally useless. Um, and they almost nearly die. They're on their own. A hunter, the only male figure really in the movie, basically is the good guy actually. So you could say it's a pro male type movie because he says, "Hey, I'll take you in for the night. Follow the road, go down here, you'll be safe." The kids go to do that. And the kids got an axe. They pick some mushrooms. They trip out, and all of a sudden they see this little house, which is a lot bigger on the inside than what it looks like on the outside, and it's a witch. And when you get to this point in the film, it's pretty neat because it looks like the boy is taken against as well. And what I like about the young woman in here is she's not trying to. She doesn't seem weak. She doesn't seem helpless. But what can a young woman do at her age, at her time? But she thinks quickly. She throws a rock at the door. She's trying to get in and all that. And then all of a sudden you start to see that there's this relationship going on where the three of them basically end up talking. And it's Hansel and Gretel basically will work for this witch, in return for like bread and food and stuff. And that's kind of the uneasy arrangement that they come to. But as soon as that starts going on, they realize that there's a bit more than meets the eye. So, from the supernatural perspective, Dalton, I mean, what did you do you like this part of Hansel and Gretel, or did you think it was overdone or not done good enough, or what?
Okay, so in regards to sort of the occult aspect of this movie, one thing I liked was the witch in the movie. The main sort of villainess is named Hulda, which might not seem significant unless you know much about old Germanic or Slavic mythology, because Hulda, in old Germanic and Slavic mythology, is a goddess of witches, and
Oh,
sometimes she's even referred to as a fairy queen. So that was a nice touch. There's even kind of a bogeyman esque quality to her in Slavic folklore, where if children are misbehaving, Holda is the figure that's supposed to like come and get them, and get them, put them in line by torturing them and so on and so forth, almost like a Krampus like figure. So yeah, that was a nice touch.
I think
As
that.
to the
Go ahead.
as to the fact that the main twist of this movie is that Hulda is looking for an apprentice, and that apprentice in this case would be Gretel. I liked that they bothered showing that, because one of the biggest pet peeves I have in horror movies, fantasy movies, all these kind of movies, is when magic is it like almost a mutant power rather than a skill that anyone can develop. But
Hmm.
they do actually show kind of her, even though Gretel appears to have some kind of natural predisposition for it, she still has to learn it and figure things out for herself, which is nice.
Yeah, and to me, I think that there's some interesting dialogue going in here because, like, say, when they're sitting down having dinner and the witch is basically telling them the chores that they can go do, you can tell there's a lot more that's going on because visually you're seeing, this great spread and you're like, well, is this old woman preparing it or how is she? And so there's certain logistical things that when you think about it, you go, oh, I don't want it to break the atmosphere of it because it's right now the score is very good. It's very like Goblin-esque, like from one of those old Dario Argento type films. I mean, it's a very 80s synth
Mm-hmm.
heavy, which I think is always awesome in these kinds of things. I'm particular to that. But the dialogue between the witch and Gretel is pretty good because a lot of what the witch is saying has a double meaning that's not really obvious. Like, I never drink wine or something really obvious from Dracula that we're all familiar with.
Yeah. Well,
Well, exactly, and it's hard to do it to it fair service. And with the kid, to your point, he's really got almost nothing to do, but he has no father figure, but he's got this idea that with the axe, I can practice my skills and do this and do that. And he's young, and it was hard to sit there and see where Gretel's allegiances were going to lie because when she got kicked out of the house, she got kicked out from her mom, who was a sad sack because she was supposed to go see this old man that was supposed to give him a job, and of course the old man's like, well, the people you're going to be seeing basically sound like you're mine, but I'm going to whore you out, and do you still have you're basically, are you a virgin because that's really valuable. And of course they didn't show her not getting the job from the guy. They just showed her storming off mad. So who knows what happened? But of course, the mom makes some comment about, well, or she makes a comment to her mom about what good is society when you have to take all your wheat or your food and give it all to whatever, and they disperse it. So I was like, they're almost getting political in here with the way they're describing it, but they don't really get into that in the film, which is good because, like I say, 95% of this film is the three of these people interacting, and most of it just the witch and Gretel. And to your point, when you mentioned the name change, Gretel and Hansel, I went, oh, they're going to go full on, wokeness with it. I don't think it is. You have a positive male role model in here. You get to see as a few scenes go on a little bit later that not everything is as it appears here in the movie. And you find out that actually it's a movie that you could honestly argue celebrates the strength of a family relationship because Gretel and Hansel um, end up stronger for all things considered by the end of this movie. Hansel, of course, is under a spell. Gretel finds out about it, and there's a couple really great scenes with how they deal with it that doesn't deal with 50 gazillion explosions or a bunch of weirdo stuff or $100 million worth of CGI. There's just a very effective scene or two in there where Hansel's just sitting in a chair in the basement, basically, where the food is prepped, if you want to call it that,
Mhm.
and he's just there against a brick wall, and there's nothing fancy, nothing about it, but it works. And they just got flames from a fire off the background. So, like I say, this movie's got some really great shots, and again, I don't know that I'd call it a horror movie. I think that most of these fables and storytellers that have come up over the years, they're just a fancy way of keeping tribal knowledge alive through the generations, and they all kind of have the same thing: is this what's the moral lesson that you're going to learn from here? And for here, it's basically about do the right thing, love your family and stay a part of it and everything too. But there's a spirit of independence in here too, because Gretel, as we find out, to your point, she's strong. She's got a natural inclination to it. And there's a big scene here at the end, which we'll get to in a moment, that basically is the rest of the movie. So, really, again, it's a 90-minute movie, not too long. As much as it's very slow paced, people like to say, it's very exact in its pacing. It gets you there really quick. There's no slow spots, no fast spots. It's very patient, and I like that. I think it's very, very tight. What did you think about this, like, middle to two-thirds part of the movie?
Um, I liked it. I thought some of the flashbacks kind of interweaved a little bit wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Because some of the storytelling, it almost would have benefited from a kind of once upon a time style, almost prologue aspect. I think if maybe they had told Holda's backstory as like a fairy tale within a fairy tale before we got to Hansel and Gretel, that would have made more sense, and it also would have detracted a little bit from because it seemed like whenever there was a down moment in the story where we were like, okay, things are settling in, everything's fine, we're working at a good clip here. It's like, oh, expository flashback, derp.
Yeah, yeah. There is one scene I wanted to ask you about specifically because I know you are interested in the occult, generally speaking, and obviously they don't go too specific as far as where the magic comes from or necessarily that it's for that region, at least not from what little I know about it. But I do want to point out to me, and maybe you know this, I assume you do, that's why I'm asking. Of course, everyone knows that a pentagram's got religious connotations or anti-religious connotations to it, but more specifically, when you have a pentagram, the 5 star reference, but where it's not just the 2 stars at the or that are the points at the base and the single tip is at the top, of course, because it's odd numbered. The kid finds actually on one of the trees a pentagram that's what we would say is upside down. Can you point out to the significance of that to people that may not be aware of it?
Okay, so the thing about the pentagram is it's not a single like univariate symbol. There are like five different things that are typically associated with the pentagram. The oldest tradition, as far as we know, is the principle of balancing of the elements, and that is something that goes all the way back to like ancient Greece.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the reason why an inverted pentagram is bad, and that's not all pentagrams, just when it's upside down, is because if the 5 points of the pentagram, as it normally should be, represent the balance of all the elements of nature and so on and so forth, then a pentagram inverted inverts the flow of that energy and therefore represents chaos and imbalance, essentially.
Well, your point about them having the Germanic type name for her as a witch, I think was a nice touch, and I agree with you on that. And seeing something like this where I saw you see the pentagram, it's inverted, I thought was pretty nice as well. Because the big scene here at the end is, of course, Gretel finds out that when she goes down into the basement, there's a pipe and it looks like it's a sewage pipe or a water runoff, and goop is coming out of there. And it turns out this is the prep area for all the kids that the witch is actually lured in there, that she grinds up into just this gooey mess of stuff, and then of course puts a little magic on it to make it look like it's a feast. So there's
Yeah,
a
she
really cool
smashes
scene
it.
where she's taking, like, the hair comes out of her mouth and some other stuff, and I thought, this is a perfect case of where less is more, where the soundtrack, the lighting of it, the scenes, the close confined quarters, everything about it was so deliberate to give you one kind of gross, disgusting scene here at the end where, this is going on. This young looking witch appears in there to do the magic, but you realize that's her, putting magic on
Yeah.
herself to make her look young, so
Yeah,
she explains all that.
they did a good job, I think, with that as well because I yeah, and maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it, but I think that if Hansel had stumbled on that, he wouldn't be able to see it. Because the thing with glamours and various magics to change the appearance of something is you can see beyond it if you have what's referred to as second sight, or you can develop what's referred to as second sight. And I think that one of the things that made Gretel such a great candidate for an apprentice to Hulda was that she at least had some kind of capacity for that second sight. So if Hansel had stumbled on that hole, he probably wouldn't have noticed anything wrong with it. But she did because she can kind of see beyond the glamour.
And that's true. And to give some support to that line of thinking, you do see a scene in there where the witch is taking her out to kind of show her how to use her inherent power a little bit. She was able to bend a tree over a little bit, I think, to get some fruit. But also, that was the whole gist of the story early on, was that as a kid, she was real sick and made to. Her father, biological father, took her to go see an enchantress who basically said, "Okay, I'll cure you, but I'm going to implant you with this." So, we could argue and joke that it's a tale of, hey, this here's a single mom, wanting her kid, and so there's this whole, feminine dynamic between, potential, mother and daughter. But I think
It,
if they
it,
went into her backstory, the witch is a little bit more, not to make her sympathetic, but just to explain it a bit more, to make it, to your point, seem like the witchcraft is more of a rare skill as opposed to supernatural effect too. That could have been interesting as well, but not necessarily needed for the movie for what it's trying to do.
mhm. I thought as far as the whole apprenticeship angle, they did a good job because, like I say, most movies about the supernatural and about the occult don't treat magic with that kind of reverence at all. So to see any inkling of that was nice, and the fact that, like I say, they made references to old folklore and to things like glamours and second sight. It was more than I was expecting. In a perfect world, every movie would do that kind of research, but in the world that we have and people don't really care, it's nice that somebody did some kind of research.
Yeah, and I think on the Extreme Horror Show here, one of the last movies we reviewed, we're not on any particular set schedule with these, it just depends on what comes up, is that I think we had covered The Ninth Gate, and we talked a little bit about magic and the occult books and stuff, the Johnny Depp movie. And so when this movie came out here, I wasn't expecting, a satanic or a really hardcore occult thing to it. I wanted to just see how they were going to make this a tale. And for me, I thought they did a really good job top to bottom. And I think that this movie is a good example of taking source material, being somewhat faithful to it, and while you're doing it, make a reasonably watchable movie out of it. And again, micro budget type movie. There's not much more to really say about it. It's not the greatest film in the world, but compared to a lot of the garbage that's out today, I think it's a solid watch. And I know that one of the things I wanted to bring up before we called it an evening is that again, I don't know if I quite consider this a horror film, but for me, it's more of a thriller. But okay, we're going to put it under the horror category. I really don't know what to make of modern horror because earlier today, Dr. Venkman and I had covered Fantasy Island, our trailer reaction for that movie that just came out, and of course that's just going to be a crap show. It looks like, but if they had
Yeah.
tried being real to the source material, Fantasy Island, with the supernatural bent, which is basically a glamorized 70s show of the monkey's paw, some moral tale. That's all that Hansel and Gretel needs to be, and you don't have to make it more complicated to that. And this is one of the things I thought, whether it was intentional or just by convention with the lack of budget, that the people that made this movie did a good job at. Is that, you know what? It is what it is. Most people may know the story or may not, as people don't really read that much anymore today. But the whole idea of family being strong, and at the end of the movie, of course, there's the real neat scene of Gretel kind of overpowering the witch, magically speaking, and this is because the witch is making Hansel climb up the ladder to go into the pot, if you will,
Um,
the cooking
yeah.
rack, over this open pit, and you're like, oh, this is really kind of cool looking. He's not going to go in there, but the way the witch gets kind of impaled against the wall and then bursts into flames, and you see Hansel climbing up the ladder, and then you see the witch kind of kicking and screaming while she's on fire. It was a really fantastic, I think, practical effect shot. I'm not sure if it's 100% practical, but it looked good.
and and it was also a really nice the interplay between Hulda in the flashbacks, Hulda in present time, and Gretel was a really nice touch because in Celtic and Germanic witchcraft, there's this idea of the triple goddess, which is the mother archetype, the maiden archetype, and the crone archetype.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look throughout the movie, all three of those essentially get referenced, with Hulda being a mother, then her becoming this crone-like character, and then of course Gretel being the youthful maiden who rises through the ranks and takes her place after Hulda is defeated. So it was sort of a nice uh, nudge to how things are kind of cyclical in that archetypal way.
Yeah, cyclical is a good word, not necessarily circle of life because it's two different people here. But yeah, Gretel ends up basically at the end when the witch is destroyed. Hansel's the glamour over Hansel's broken, the spell, if you will, that he's under, and so basically she says, "Okay, I'm gonna send you on this horse. You're gonna go away." He's got his axe. You've got something, go seek and find your destiny, if you want to look at it like that, in the way, that kind of speech. And she's like, I'm going to stay here and try to work on my powers, and I'll try to do the right thing. But of course, you see her fingertips turn black, like the witches were there at the end. So even if she's under dark magic, if they were to make a sequel to this, the question is she going to turn bad? Is it not? I mean, but I like that too. I thought it was a nice touch. There was a price to pay for her to defeat the witch, and that ultimately means taking her place. But in doing so, it strengthened the bond she had with her brother, gave her brother's life purpose, and moved on. So again, not particularly religious, spiritual, maybe, if you want to call it, which maybe you could argue that religion, a lot of these tales come from. But overall, like I say, not a lot going on. We're probably trying to sound way too intellectual about it than the average person who that sees this movie and goes, it's just a dumb, slow movie with the kids in there, and it looked kind of cool. Yeah, that's true, but no, this was definitely better than Meg, no question about it. It's not a bad
they,
film at
they,
all.
they put they put some thought into this, and I think I think if you don't go in at least looking for nods to that, you're probably going to be missing something, because I'm pretty sure that the director might be Eastern European, and therefore that might be why he knows some of this folklore, or maybe he was raised on it. And I like that he was able to use that without necessarily beating you over the head with it, because of course everyone knows the Hansel and Gretel story thanks to Jacob and Elijah Grimm in the 1800s. But given that most of those stories come from old Germany and old Slavic countries, there's a lot of that folklore that those stories grew around that we don't know a lot in the Western world. So it's nice to kind of reincorporate some of that back in.
And generally speaking, to your point here as we close out, you're right. Most of the, your Eastern European type stories in general, I think it's fairly safe to say that a lot of them were supposed to be scary and a lot darker than what we here in the West think of, simply because the point of these stories was to scare kids into submission, into whatever tribe you're in and your family, your group, as society's evolved. And that's how, like you say, wisdom was passed down in a particular form, not just song or book or religion, but in these kinds of stories. And you're right, the West totally whitewashes them, for lack of a better term. And of course, turn of the century when Disney became a name and really popular, took a lot of these things and totally sanitized them and made them absolutely nothing like what
Sanitize
they
them
originally
beyond the
were.
point of recognizability to the point where every child wants to have a fairy godmother. When if you actually look at old fairy lore, fairies are not to be trifled with, and that was one of the points of these stories because back when these stories were first circulated, people had an actual belief in these kind of entities, and these kind of entities were not even the nice ones were not always supposed to be trusted.
Yeah, yeah. Any final thoughts about the movie? Any future expectations if they were to make a sequel?
If they were to make a sequel, I'd like to kind of see um sort of Gretel's journey into becoming more competent as a magic user, as a witch. The problem is unless they want to make a story about her falling from grace, which I don't necessarily know if I would want, I don't know if they could make it in the same genre unless they want to lean more into the dark fantasy aspects and lean a little bit away from the thriller horror aspect, which I personally would be fine with because it's a perfect natural continuation of the story. But generally, with these kind of stories, you want the sequel to be in the same genre as the movie that spawned it. So you almost necessarily now have to have her fall from grace, or you could introduce another witch that kind of wants to challenge her power, and then she is the good witch archetype fighting the uh, darker force. That would be interesting.
To me, because the positive role model hunter that helps them out, saves them from like a demon type early on, he's only in there for a few moments. I thought, what if this is just in the future? Hansel's, I'm not even going to say an ass kicker, but just a competent male in this harsh world as an adult, married, maybe he's got kids, and maybe something happens to one of his kids, and then he realizes, I got to go kill this witch now. Kind of like the same story, but now it's him bringing his daughter, and he realizes, oh, the witch I'm bringing it to is my sister, and I got to kill my sister, and see if they do something like that. I know that sounds kind of dark, but that's what these things are supposed to be, and I think they could do something with that too. Because if they water it down, it's just going to lose what little effect it may
I,
have.
I think it might be a more interesting story the if he has a daughter with whoever he ends up marrying, and she starts manifesting powers, and he has to take his daughter to Gretel and trust that she will
Do
still
the right
be
thing.
benevolent.
Yeah,
That would be a nice. Is she? Did she manage to stay benevolent, or did she, fall into the darkness, or even if she did stay benevolent, do I even want to trust her? Because again, even the benevolent characters in fairy tales are not necessarily to be trusted because they're not human. They're other kinds of beings, and they don't necessarily know the ins and outs of human custom and human civility and human morality. So even the good ones not necessarily always trustworthy.
yeah. Again, not a big budget movie. I'm trying to look up the numbers now as we talk just to see how well it's doing. Um, you know, look, small budget doesn't need to make much to come around it, and these type of movies are going to continue to get made. One of the things that we did talk about, see on Top 10 Tuesdays as we cover the best movies in each of the years. I think we're up to 2005 or six now. But one of the themes I had talked about was that sometime in the mid to late 90s, movies stopped being good. They were still kind of fun or entertaining, but they seemed to slip a level. But definitely by 2000, they really dropped off the cliff, in my opinion. And I think one of the themes is that, again, supply and demand, you get an opportunity where you have a lot of movies out there, any of them that do well, you're going to see a lot of duplicates. And the micro budget, small type movie like this, it doesn't have to be all that great, but it can still make okay money and spawn a few sequels. It can definitely push it. And in today's $100 million or $5 million type films, no in between, it's nice to see that it seems like some of these smaller films are doing well. And of course, we have Fantasy Island coming out, The Invisible Man, a couple of other ones, Brahms to The Boy. That's
Thank
all I
you.
think out now, which we'll talk about later. But I look forward to actually having these types of thriller horror movies because I prefer these things. It's doing decent overseas from what I can see right now, so hopefully that gives it some legs. Because just because the American audience isn't fond of it 100% because it's too slow or whatever it is they don't like about it, it's not action packed or like a lot of movies are today. It's not one of these CGI spot fests. I still think it's decent. So if there was a sequel, I think I'd be interested in seeing it.
There's a lot of interesting things they could do with this, I think, if they wanted to.
Yeah, and to your point, it's an oldie. It's a classic. It's not too complicated, but that doesn't. It still means you can do it well. So, just start with good ingredients, and see how you prepare it, and boom, you got a nice little meal of a movie.
I mean, it's especially jarring when you consider that the last major Hansel and Gretel movie we got was Hansel and Gretel Witch Slayers, which was like a campy action adventure movie, and here we are with kind of an art house version.
Oh dear Lord, Hawkeye in his best film role yet. Um, all right, tell everybody how they can get a hold of you and what you do.
Alrighty. Hi guys, I'm Dalton Mortimer. I go by the Authenticator. My channel is the Authenticator. If any of the occult philosophizing I did in this episode is your thing or something you might find you're interested in, I do that a lot on my channel. I even have a series on my channel called A Mystics Vlogs where I look at fantasy movies and horror movies and shows and things from an occult perspective. So if that's something you're interested in, then I've got you covered there. I also do philosophy, current events sometimes. Sometimes I just make a video to shoot the shit. But yeah, the channel is called The Authenticator, and you can find me on Twitter at The Authenticator, spelled without a U because Twitter is stupid and doesn't allow for the appropriate number of characters. Um, but you can find me just about everywhere else online at The Authenticator, spelled normally. Cheers, guys.
Yeah, Dalton's the occasional pop-up guest on any one of these shows here too, just depending on what happens, and it's always a nice, pleasant surprise too. So, Dalton, I'd like to thank you personally for coming on and doing this review with me, and for Dalton, myself, the Doctor, E, everybody else from the Extreme Movie Show. Thank you. Good night. Stay extreme.